Hello, welcome to Anatomy Lab. This time I'm going to show you the visceral organs contained within the chest cavity or the pleural cavity. And the first thing you have to do is of course to make the incisions during face-to-face activities natin so that you will be able to reflect the rib cage like so and reveal the visceral organs inside, mostly belonging to the respiratory system. So give me a second so I can get the rib cage out of the way. Right, so the chest cavity, the pleural cavities are divided into a left, sorry, this is the right, and then this is the left pleural cavity. Okay, I'll have a separate discussion or video on the coelomic cavities and the serous membranes covering those cavities of the cat. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the organs, not the connective tissues and mesenteries and pleura, so that it will be a focused video. Okay, so once you have opened the pleural cavities, the prominent structures that you're going to see will be the lungs, these dark organs here. And then this one is a muscle, that's the diaphragm. Okay, so we'll start with the lungs. There will be a left and a right lung from the perspective of the specimen, of course. And then each one of those lungs will be further subdivided into lobes. There's going to be a anterior, middle, and posterior lobes. So 3 lobes in total. Likewise, on the left side, there's going to be a anterior left lobe, middle left lobe, and then posterior left lobe of the lung. But in the right side in general, the right lung in general is larger compared to the left lung. So there's an additional lobule. So for the posterior lobe of the right lung is actually further subdivided into a lateral. The one you see here is the lateral lobule of the right posterior lobe of the lung. That's a long name, right? But you have to be that hyper specific when giving an answer. This is the lateral lobule of the posterior lobe of the right lung. And then the one there actually covered, when you first open the pleural cavities, it will still be covered by connective tissue. So this one, let me show you. That one, that tinier lobule is the medial lobule of the posterior lobe of the right lung. So there's a medial lobule and there's the lateral lobule for the posterior lobe, right? And that connective tissue that I told you that covers initially the medial lobule is actually the caval fold. But we'll get to that when I made a video on the mesenteries and the coelomic cavities. But that's the medial lobule. And another prominent structure is of course the heart. This is the heart. Okay, tucked inside its own cavity, which is the pericardial cavity, separate from the left and right and left pleural cavity. Okay, and then after the lungs, so remember when we dissected the throat, the respiratory tract in the throat. That's the trachea, the windpipe, right? And the windpipe will go straight and enter the pleural cavities and will be split into two primary bronchi, and then those bronchi will enter the lungs, and it will be further split into many finer branches inside the lungs called bronchioles, those finer branches of the bronchi, right? So the lungs, actually, if you make a cross section of a lung, you're going to see that it will be perforated with tinier holes. Those are the finer branches of the respiratory tract, the bronchioles. And then eventually each bronchiole will terminate into a thin-walled and moist sac called alveolus, pleural alveoli, where the gas exchange actually occurs. So let me see if I can show you. Let's cut a piece of the anterior lobe of the right lung. If you look at closely, there are holes, right? Those are the finer branches that I'm talking about, the bronchioles, which will later terminate into an alveolus, okay? Where the bronchus enters the lungs is called the root of the lung, or the radix. And there are other structures that penetrate the lungs at this root. For example, you see those dark tubes there. Those are actually pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary blood vessels, arteries and veins also enter or exit the lungs via the root of the lung, or the radix. Okay. Next, we examine the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the main breathing or respiratory muscle in mammals, that is. Okay. And it's a skeletal muscle, meaning it can be voluntarily controlled. Not that you are always conscious of using it. So it can be under reflex action. You're unaware of it. But if you choose to do so, you can actually control the contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm by through meditation, for example, if you're conscious of it. Right? And being a skeletal, voluntary muscle, it has an origin, insertion, and action. Okay, kala nyo, tapos na yung muscles, ano? Okay, so the origin of the diaphragm, it has a lot of origins. So this is a skeletal model of the thorax of the cat. So the diaphragm would be located here in the posterior side of the rib cage, and it has an origin on the last few costal cartilages. It can also take its origin from the lumbar vertebrae, and it also has an origin from the siphisternum. So this siphisternum, the costal cartilages, and the lumbar vertebrae. Those are the origins of the diaphragm. And then it will insert into a disc-shaped tendon called the central tendon of the diaphragm. It's hard to see, but if you just look at the center of the diaphragm, I don't see. Yeah, there's a white connective tissue at the center of the diaphragm. That's the central tendon, the insertion of the muscle. Okay, so when the diaphragm, so naturally by default, the diaphragm is shaped like a dome, right? Protruding into the pleural cavities. There. Side view. Protruding inside the pleural cavities. But when it contracts, it pulls the central tendon a bit caudally, such that the pressure, or the volume first, the volume inside the thoracic or pleural cavity will be expanded. And that increase in intrathoracic pressure will decrease the air pressure inside the chest cavity, and that will drive the flow of air into the respiratory tract. Right? So when the diaphragm contracts, expanding the volume of the pleural cavities. It will decrease the air pressure and drive the air into the respiratory tracts, filling the lungs with oxygen-rich air. So that's the physiology, basic physiology of breathing. That's the inspiration phase. And when the diaphragm relaxes, then it naturally decreases the volume of the pleural cavities, and that will help you exhale the deoxygenated air out of your lungs. So it's time to look at the heart. Right, so this is the heart. We're going to examine its anatomy more closely once we go to the circulatory system unit. But that's the heart. It has its own cavity, as I said, the pericardial cavity, which is covered by coelomic membranes. The outer wall of the pericardial cavity is covered by the parietal pericardium, whereas the inner wall, which is fused to the heart wall muscle, is called the visceral pericardium. A strap of a sternum muscle here. And if you look at it, there are connective tissues going from it to the heart, right, to the center. And that's the mediastinal septum. I'm going to discuss it more in detail when I make the video about the coelomic cavities. But it's an interesting structure. It's actually very complicated. There's a space inside, okay, which is the mediastinal space, pero let's save that for later. And within the mediastinal septum, there's a lymphoid organ here, just anterior or ventral to the heart. That yellowish organ there is the thymus gland, which is a source of white blood cells, specifically the T cells, the T lymphocytes. That's why they're called T cells anyway, because they mature here. The thymus gland is the site where the T cells mature. And as the cat matures, apparently, the thymus gland becomes replaced by fatty tissue. It undergoes fatty degeneration. And so maybe in some of our cat specimens, you won't be able to see an intact thymus gland if your cat specimen is old. Right? But in this case, it's intact still. This is the thymus gland, ventral to the heart. So what other structures can we see? So if we look at the dorsal wall of the pleural cavity, you'll see some tubes here. You have to reflect the left lung to see them. So you look at the left pleural cavity and reflect the left lung, and look at the dorsal thoracic wall. There are at least two tubes here. The one more ventral, and I ripped some of the connective tissue here to be able to see it clearly. That's the esophagus. Yeah, continuation of the digestive tract from the pharynx. So this is the esophagus. And the one more dorsal, this one, if you trace it, it's actually arching and going to which structure? The heart. So from the heart, it's arching like that. That's the aorta. Specifically, this portion is the thoracic aorta, sometimes called the dorsal aorta. So dorsal aorta, that white tube there. And the one ventral to it is the esophagus. And both the aorta and esophagus will penetrate the diaphragm posteriorly, so that they will continue here into the abdominal or peritoneal cavity. There are also veins. So the aorta is an artery, the main artery, right, that carries blood from the heart to the rest of the body. But there are veins that collect all of the blood from the body back into the heart. And let me see if we can see them yet. This one, let me rip some connective tissue so you can see them. So that's a trachea. It's obvious because of the tracheal rings, right? The trachea is reinforced by cartilaginous rings. And ventral to it is a plastic-like tube. So what's difficult about veins is that when you dissect them, when we go to the circulatory system, they're very thin. Veins are typically thin-walled compared to arteries. And so in our specimens, they will look kind of like fascia or connective tissue at first if you're not trained to see them. So it's like a thin-walled plastic tube. But this is a vein. That's the precaval vein, also called as the anterior vena cava or superior vena cava, and you can see that it enters the right atrium of the heart. So that's the precaval vein. That's the trachea, about to split into the bronchi, entering the lungs via the root. And then there's a posterior vena cava or postcaval vein, and it's located within the caval fold that I mentioned earlier, along with the medial lobule of the right posterior lobe of the lung. It's quite a mouthful, but let's look for it. So that one, okay, I'll just skip once I've figured out how to show it. Okay, I hope you can see it. Let me focus. Okay, you see that? This is the heart. And there's another plastic-like tube down there. I have removed some of the caval fold so you can easily see. This is the postcaval vein, or posterior vena cava, and alongside it is the medial lobule. Medial lobule of the posterior lobe of the right lung. Okay, get used to it. And when you first open the pleural cavities, they're still covered by the caval fold. Okay, so you have to do some dissection to see them. Postcava, medial lobule, precava, and those are the structures you need to know inside the pleural cavity. Coming next would be the contents. We examine the contents of the peritoneal cavity, and see you then.